Hello and welcome to Beaver Hunter Scale Models. This video will be about how I built the Rye Field Model Sturmgeschütz Hier, where I combined the best from all worlds like armor texture, custom weld beads, photo etched and 3D printed parts into one hopefully interesting and unique in detail model. So if this sounds interesting to you, please stay tuned. This is the stuff I will use for this project: the RFM StuG with the matching upgrade set by RFM, some StuG crew figures by Dynamo Models, and the later painting will be done with the AK Real Colors camouflage set and some markers I want to try out here and there. I started with getting an overview of the kit's parts and the instructions for both the kit and the upgrade set. And I quickly realized that this will be a lot of paperwork. I flipped through the instructions to see where the PE parts will be placed, so I don't miss a part and use the plastic one instead. Luckily, the instructions are very well done and it's clearly visible from the upgrade kit instructions which parts are going to be used at what step, so I wasn't too worried. I then started with the parts for the lower hull and it felt great to be back at plastic scale modeling after so much resin figures, resin kits and the resin bust. And I here already noticed the beautiful details on the plastic parts. Some details like these flame cuts at the front armor plate were looking not that bad, but I wanted to improve them a bit more. So I grabbed me my hobby knife and pulled it through the molded flame cuts to increase them. Then I used thin plastic cement and with a thin layer smoothed out my cuts and with that easily emphasized these details here. I then put together the lower hull by connecting the 5 parts with just a drop of plastic cement, so I could adjust the angle and made sure everything was sitting right. As this is my first modern kit, I wasn't used to that, as I was building mostly older Tamiya kits in the last years, and there the lower hull is usually one part. But I quickly realized that the great details of the parts justified it using more parts for one piece compared to the older kits. When I was sure everything was sitting right and the angle was good, I slapped the inside with plastic cement, so I was sure everything stays where it's supposed to be and it's not moving ever again. The reason why I used older kits in the past was because I thought I was smart saving money with buying cheap old kits. It was only now that I realized that I don't save anything when buying an old kit, spending more money on aftermarket parts than on this modern kit and the upgrade set together. All wheels still had these casting seams on the running surface. I guess some things never change, so I used a sanding stick to remove them by sanding all 40 wheels, because I had to do 20 pairs of running wheels. Another thing I save with using a modern kit is the most important thing: time. It would take me time I don't have to get the old kit into the condition where I open the box of a modern kit and start building. And as a hobby scale modeler, when I'm lacking one thing, it's time. And in addition, this build was so much fun with all these nice and detailed parts. So thanks again to the friend who opened my eyes for using modern kits from now on. When all wheels were sanded, I added some damage and wear and tear to some of the wheel's rubber parts with my hobby knife, cutting pieces out and making notches in the surface. I tried to make this look irregular and not man-made, what wasn't that easy as it sounds. When I finally made it through all wheel pairs, I could mount them on the suspension and was awarded with movable parts, what is a nice detail. And I noticed how good looking all these modern parts are. I kept the wheels removable for later painting and I finished them with a thin layer of thin plastic cement. This not only smoothed out the damage I added, it also fixed the sanding remnants into the surface, giving it a rough, used look, what later will be a nice detail when they will be weathered. Then I reached the point where to add the gearbox cover. It also has nice details like the weld beads next to the interlocking armor, but when put in place there were these small gaps at the connecting places. So I thought this might be a good place to add some custom weld beads to add some more additional detail and close the gaps here. So I grabbed me my scribing tools and removed the molded welds. At my last tank, the Penta D, I renewed every weld bead I could find, even the ones which will be never seen again because they got covered by Zimmerit, dirt and mud or other parts. This whole build took me like forever, and as I want to learn building faster and more efficient, I will only replace the welds at this vehicle where they will be visible later or where it was necessary, like in this case. I used green stuff 2-part putty, rolled it into thin wieners and pushed this into the scribed gaps with a moistened toothpick. It's important that the toothpick is slightly wet, so the putty is not sticking to it and can be pushed into the gaps. I then used my welding tool, a C-shaped piece of copper foil, and added the weld texture to the putty. And I think most of you know where I got this from. The photo-etched spare track holders were welded in place too at this opportunity. This not only helps to connect them to the plastic part, it also adds another nice detail to the model. I definitely don't call myself a welding god, but I think it's still worth the effort as it makes the model more unique and adds more detail compared to the plastic welds. And you can't get better when not trying and practicing things and techniques. To make the front part more interesting, and because I love scale models with a lot of different materials and colors, I added armor texture to the front armor plates. I here used the proven method with Tamiya putty and plastic cement and stippled that mix onto the surface with an old stiff brush. I tried to work very accurate here so I don't mess up the edges or other details. The brushes can be cleaned easily with pure plastic cement afterwards and used again at the next project. Not for painting of course, this is over. For the smaller parts I used a smaller brush which came also handy for the gaps at the front armor plate. When the putty was dry again, I used a fine sanding mat and gently smoothed the surface to remove protruding pimples and end up with a nice textured steel surface which will look great after painting. And that is the reworked front area of the StuG. Not perfect maybe, but it has definitely more character now. Photo etched parts. Photo etched parts are by far the most complicated, time consuming, trickiest, fiddly, most detailed, most hated and most loved parts we can do on a scale model. Anyone who ever made a German tool clamp can relate this, I guess. Maybe a year ago I made only bigger PE parts, if at all, because I feared them and thought they would drive me nuts. But then it itched and scratched me to try learning how to handle and build them, and after some time to get used to them and know how to handle them, I think I can say at least I don't suck anymore at doing them. A bending tool, although not cheap, can really help and make our life easier here for exact bending. And some putter fix for fixing them on the table while working on them also helps a lot. I don't want to lose too much time here talking about PE parts. I made a very detailed part about them in my Penta video you can find on my channel, including soldering them. After I made the first parts here, I remembered how it was done, and with some patience, a steady hand and the best glue for PE parts, I fought my way through the photo etched madness. In some cases I resorted to 3D printed parts like these tool clamps. I made them on the Penta to prove myself I can do them, but these parts are still my nemesis. And talking about being fast and efficient, these printed parts are looking maybe even better and are way faster to install. And slow but steady I managed to complete the side fenders with all tools and add-ons. The reddish printed parts you can see here are from the upgrade set and really beautiful produced and quickly installed. I could then install the two fenders and again had to make sure they are sitting in the right position and angle. There are way more parts in this build at this stage than it might look like. In some cases where an old kit has one part for one piece, it's 3 to 5 parts here. Luckily it's really fun putting these together and the improved details are making this effort justified. I can't believe how much time I wasted building old kits just because I thought I would save a few bucks. Don't make the same mistakes that I did. The two front fenders had these ugly gaps in the kinks, so here came the time for soldering again. I prefer soldering the bigger parts because you can't put them together with a stronger connection than soldering. They get really solid and almost indestructible. Unfortunately, I am not skilled enough to solder the smaller parts. So after putting some soldering fluid onto the areas with a pen, I applied the lead with the iron to fill the gaps and attached the small edge frame solid to the fender. And after some sanding off the remnants, I was rewarded with some solid, nice looking fenders. To mount the fenders I had to build the hinges, and bending PE parts into a round shape was always a job that gave me headaches in advance. But some putter fix was a good help here. I fixed the part to my building plate with it, pressed on a drill bit where the rounding should be, and with my hobby knife bended the part around the drill bit. After threading a piece of copper wire through the hinges, I could then glue them to the fender and this combination to the model. Adding the springs to the fenders was one of the worst experiences of this build. It almost screwed my nerves because the slightly too strong springs always came loose when I tried to attach the second end to the fender. And only after countless tries, some helping amount of superglue, a lot of international swearing and most important patience, I somehow managed to fix the springs to the model. In the end I was rewarded with in theory movable fenders, but because of my fear of springs getting loose again, I just gently moved them for demonstration purposes here the last time. And with these last parts the lower hull was completed and there was only one thing left to do before moving on to the upper area and making this look like a Sturmgeschütz and not a Panzer IV. For better handling while painting and especially airbrushing, I glued a nut under the lower hull and there I could put in a screw with which I could place it into my professional painting stand, a wooden plank with a hole. Then I could finally move on to the upper parts and the upper hull was looking really good to me, like it came out of the box. So I just reworked the flame cuts of the interlocking armor after gluing the back piece to the hull, just like I did it on the lower hull with my knife and some plastic cement. The big weld beads were looking nicely to me, so in my effort to being efficient I decided to not rebuild them completely, but to just slightly emphasize them by giving them more depth and texture. I therefore softened them with a layer of thin cement, added some deeper welds with my hobby knife and with another layer of thin cement smoothened everything out. The Kanonenblende or Topfblende received its armoured texture to make it more interesting. And so did the vertical sides of the upper hull. I here tried to work very accurate and to not fill up the holes for later parts or cover any details like bolts and rivets. And by varying the thickness of the textured putty, that was not a big deal. When the putty was dry again, I sanded it smooth with a fine sanding mat. The only welds I renewed here were these two because the original ones were too tiny and got covered by the armoured texture. And I thought it would add a nice additional detail to the upper hull, although they might not be very accurate. I liked the heavy look it added to the model. Although I wanted to be fast and accurate, I decided to build the complete inner cannon with all its parts, because I needed a break from all the tiny PE parts, and building this nice detailed working cannon with some plastic cement only was very fun and relaxing. And I always like to learn more about how the vehicles looked inside and how they were built and items placed. Gluing the cannon and upper hull in place was a different story and the opposite of relaxing. The problem was that I could not just glue the cannon to the lower hull, because that would avoid the upper hull from sliding into its position. So after a lot of dry fitting and test mounting, I built up some courage and added some glue to the upper hull, slid it into position and then arranged the cannon. Only then did I add some glue to the cannon fixing points and made sure everything was sitting at the place it should and could move like it's supposed to. And with some thin cement I eliminated all gaps by pressing the lower and upper parts together. Now it really began to look like a StuG, and I already liked a lot how the model looked and how it was developing. Building the engine compartment was fun and pretty straightforward, again with a mix of all materials. And that was very refreshing compared to the Panther, where I split the build into chapters, like 2 weeks of plastic parts followed by 2 weeks of PE parts. Mixing it here was way better for my motivation and the fun of building. The engine hatch was the first opportunity to build my own handles. I drilled holes into the supposed places, and with some 0.5mm copper wire and my handle bending tool, I quickly created a custom handle for the hatch. This was then stabilized with a piece of balsa wood for a matching distance and glued from the inside with black PE super glue, so it's looking clean from the outside. After gluing the upper engine compartment in place, I realized I'm in trouble because there was a gap on the right side of the compartment, what wasn't there on the left side. The reason for that was because I obviously glued the side piece to the fender in a wrong angle in the very early stage of this build. Most of the part my bad, but maybe not the best order of the instructions to attach this part so early to the fender without knowing the exact needed angle. So I here had to add a custom weld to fill this gap. I don't think that this will be much a difference and noticeable after painting, so although I was a bit angry about my mistake, I think I could solve it okay somehow and live and continue the build with it. The MG shield was a challenge again, with round banded PE parts for hinges, parts in all shapes and sizes, but totally worth the effort. And I mounted it temporarily with a piece of wire, so I will be able to remove it for painting. The commander's cupola was also a part of the category worth the effort, with all the PE parts from the upgrade set, with a beautiful detailed lock mechanism, and it was very satisfying to glue this piece into place. I fought my way through a lot more PE parts like holders for C-hooks, spare tracks and rollers, added some texture to the exhaust for a nice rusty finish when painting, and some custom handles here and there. Then came the part that made me really nervous in advance, the side skirts and their holders. I here used soldering again to fill the kinks and made the long banded holders more durable. Especially the end areas were tricky here because I had to bend and fix them in the right angle. After sanding off the solder remnants, I glued the holding teeth to them, and I here originally planned to solder them too. But the glue I used here worked so well that this was quicker and more efficient way for my soldering skill level. And after removing excess superglue with debonder, I could mount the holders to the vehicle. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to film this because it was very tricky mounting the long holders in the right position and angle, and I didn't want to screw up here. I needed a lot of sheet metal for the skirts holders, so there was a lot of bending, sanding and gluing necessary to build the needed amount. Because I wanted to give the vehicle a used look, I did not add all the side skirts, but enough to make it look somehow realistic, and I ended up with 3 side skirts per side, what meant at least 36 holding sheets in all sizes and shapes. And adding some subtle damage to some of the side skirts was supposed to improve the used look of the vehicle. And after gluing the holding sheets to the side skirts, I was rewarded with the feeling of success to mount these succeeded side skirts onto the vehicle. And I was very relieved after finishing this last big challenge of this build, and with that out of the way I was expecting only fun things to be left to do. I don't want to miss the opportunity to mention the super glue by Bergswerk again, which really made my life easier here. The PE2 glue is thicker and almost sticks immediately to the parts when connecting them. In combination with the activator spray, this worked so well that even the hardest looking PE parts were really fun in the end, and I used way less soldering than I originally planned. It was time now to add the details that make models more interesting and unique, and I started with tarps here. I therefore mixed green stuff putty with baby powder and rolled it out very thin. The baby powder here prevents the putty from sticking to the roller and to my fingers. I placed the tarp on top of cling film to prevent it from sticking to the model and modeled it to the contours of the engine deck. I then added equipment and cargo like a barrel, jerry cans and ammunition boxes and tried to model the tarp around them with a silicone brush. I am no expert or tarp ninja, and I hope to give the tarp some good and natural looking folds. I played around with placement and positions until I was satisfied and then let it rest to dry. The gap at the top blender was not good looking to me, so I here too placed a tarp and modeled it to the vehicle's shape and let one of the crew members make a test sitting so he will harmonize later with the tarp. When everything had time to dry, I could remove the cargo with the cling film and then had a removable piece what can be painted separately and had the perfect shape to be placed onto the engine deck. I made some last corrections with my silicone brush and when needed glued single parts to the tarp, as because of the baby powder the equipment pieces were not sticking to the tarp themselves very strongly. The last bigger and time consuming job was to build the tracks. I decided against the kids' tracks because they were not very durable and detailed, but for the 3D printed tracks from tankbrusher I bought online and printed myself. They have self-securing pins what really work great compared to the Panzer Art tracks I used on the Panther, which lost pins only when looking too hard at them. It was really fun putting these together. They were way more durable than I expected with these tiny small pins, and they looked way better than the kids' ones. All in all, I was really surprised and amazed how good these tracks are. If you own a resin printer and need tracks or other tank parts, check out Tankbrusher on Patreon or cults3d.com. I assembled the tracks in bars of 11 links like I printed them and linked these units to one track. Like this the job was less boring and I had a better overview of how much track links I had to do for one track. Mounting tracks is usually a very tricky job for me, but here it also worked like a dream. I pulled the tracks through the upper rollers, mounted the driving wheel and linked the tracks with a piece of copper wire so I can test mount them, but also remove them easily for painting later. And I was really happy with the result and how they worked with the model. Then I added the last details like towing ropes, the Dynamo Models StuG crew, which will be painted in a separate video after the vehicle itself, and added some infantry equipment from Faustus I also bought and printed to make this vehicle look more lived in and used by adding some personal equipment of the crew and additional stuff like grenades. And yeah, with these last parts it's finally done. I am super happy with the result in a lot of ways. It took me 2.5 weeks from gluing the first parts together until the finished model with the last added details was standing in front of me. That is for me super fast with this amount of PE parts, used techniques and materials, and as learning to be efficient was on my to-do list here too, I can say that at least to me I was successful with that too. As a comparison, I needed 6 weeks to build my Panther tank. That came partly from more used techniques there, but also because I splitted this more into chapters like plastic parts, PE parts, texture and simmer it. This was less motivating and more time consuming. And like I said before, I wasted time doing stuff that later got covered and never be seen again. So this build was a full success with being fast, losing fear of spending a lot of time with unnecessary jobs and having more fun on the way building modern kits. And I have to admit, I somehow fell in love with this model and already liked it more than any other tank I built in the past. If you are still there, thank you very much for watching. I hope you like this build as much as I do, and if I maybe caught your interest how this will be developing, I would be happy if you stay on this channel and maybe even support me by subscribing. And I'm looking forward to your feedback and criticism. So, all that's left to say is thank you again, stay safe and until the next time.